Ashwin Ramaswami has become the first Gen Z Indian American to be running for a Senate seat. Ramaswami is a Democrat, not to be mistaken with Vivek Ramaswamy. He is hoping to replace incumbent Republican Shawn Still. Earlier, we spoke to him on several...
Welcome back to Nationally. In this limited series podcast produced by Immigrantly Media, we discuss issues that matter to some of the most overlooked immigrant BIPOC communities in the U.S. As the election season first approaches, we'll examine key moments that will paint a clear picture of what to expect come November. We have done a deep dive into particular demographic groups. However, today's episode will be a little bit different.
In last week's episode, we covered the Indian diaspora in Georgia and the important role that Indian Americans will likely play within the swing state in the upcoming election. In the course of our discussion, we mentioned a young Indian American Democratic candidate by the name of Ashwin Ramaswamy. The 24-year-old is running for Georgia State Senate District 48. The son of immigrants, Ramaswamy grew up in Johns Creek, Georgia, in a South Indian Tamil family. The aspiring politician attended both Stanford University for computer science and Georgetown University Law. In addition to his studies, Ramaswamy has spent the last 3 years working for the Federal Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Agency, helping ensure election security. However, in recent years, he's become increasingly aware of the threat that certain politicians themselves pose to election security. A primary example: his opponent, State Senator Shawn Still, indicted alongside former President Trump in 2023 for his involvement in their alleged election interference in Georgia in an attempt to overturn the results of the 2020 election.
Well, just moments ago, a hearing wrapped up for the only elected official charged in Georgia's 2020 election interference case.
State Senator Shawn Still, he spent the day in a Fulton County courtroom arguing for several criminal charges against him to be dismissed.
Ramaswamy has quit his job in cybersecurity in order to run against Still, who he now considers a greater threat to democracy. At the center of Ramaswamy's campaign are the issues of protecting democratic institutions, improving education, building Georgia's economy, passing common sense gun safety laws, and protecting access to reproductive health care.
If Ramaswamy wins, he'll not only be the first Indian American state senator in Georgia, but also the youngest state senator in Georgia's history. Today, we'll talk to Ramaswamy himself and ask him a few questions that we've had in our minds. We're your host, Juan Diego Ramirez.
And I'm Sara Sadhwani.
And this is Nationally.
You know, Ashwin, it's somewhat unusual for a 24-year-old such as yourself to run for office. Can you tell us a little bit about what drew you to politics and compelled you to run in this election? And why now? Why this particular election?
I would say that throughout my life, I've always been interested in public service. I grew up in Johns Creek as a son of Indian immigrants. I've always been involved with the local community. And one thing I learned at the Indian Community Center was this value we would call seva, which also means giving back to the community and giving more than what we take. So whatever I ended up doing, I'd always thought back about how can I give back and ensure that other folks have the same opportunities or better than I've had. And that's ultimately what I decided to do with this campaign. Because I realized that I had these incredible opportunities. I was able to go to Stanford, go to Georgetown Law, work in the government, be at this really intersection of tech law, policy. But back home, I would see that we're not necessarily progressing in the way that we should be, right? So it's harder and harder to get into colleges, housing's becoming less and less affordable, healthcare costs going up, and of course, people like Shawn Still trying to overturn our election results. And all of that made me realize that now is the moment where we need new voices. It doesn't matter how old they are. What it matters more is who's actually from the community and understands these issues and is willing to listen and lead with honesty and integrity. So I picked this particular seat because, first of all, I believe I have the background for it, right? I went to law school. I worked in tech law policy. I used to work very closely in the federal government along with folks in Congress as well. And I believe I can bring those skills back to serve our state. And the fact that my opponent was criminally indicted, there's really an opportunity here where we can show that someone who's able to be a steady hand at the Capitol, bring folks together regardless of where they are politically, but we all should agree on the fact that we want our elections to be secure, and we want people with honesty and integrity, not folks who are going to get involved in these national controversies and drag the state down, honestly.
So I'm glad you actually brought that up, because now in this political world where people are sort of going into their corners, I'm wondering, as you're starting your political career, where do you see yourself in today's political landscape?
Today's political landscape is too polarized. It's fine to have different camps of people who believe different things. But the problem today is that if you're on one camp, you basically, often people shun the other camp, and they don't want to even talk with them or find common ground. So I would say I'm running as a Democrat, right? And my values align with the Democratic Party in terms of, I believe in things like we should make sure we protect reproductive rights, making sure where government is working well for people, and ensuring that we have a balance between businesses being successful, but also protecting workers as well. But at the same time, I love talking to folks who disagree with me. I think that's really crucial to being an effective legislator and a public servant. So whatever I do is something which I want to make sure that we're building consensus around things and we're able to get things done that folks actually support and can agree on are important. Because regardless of what party you're in, everyone agrees that we should have our teachers being paid a fair wage so that we have good schools. People agree that we should have safer communities, zero mass shootings. We also agree that we want to make sure that we're taking advantage of these new advancements in technology. The key thing is that how are we making that happen? Are we just doing it by picking one side and just sticking, going entirely shunning everyone else? Or are we doing it in a way that's bringing people together?
I love, Ashwin, that you brought up trying to get people to get along, to form consensus, and that you like talking to people who maybe don't see eye to eye with you, because my guess is that happens a whole lot in the swing state of Georgia. I want to hear a little bit more about Senate District 48. Of course, as you've mentioned, it includes the city of Johns Creek, where you grew up. And Johns Creek is, of course, also known for having an incredibly large Asian American population. Tell us a little bit about your campaign and what it is that you're doing to do some of that unique, culturally competent, perhaps, outreach to the Asian American community. And then also, what does that outreach look like? Does it look different to the non-Asian American community, to those folks who might be Trump supporters? How is your message kind of landing with those folks as well?
It's all about meeting people where they are. I think it's really important in politics to be clear what your values are and what you're fighting for. But at the same time, being able to speak other folks' language, right? And as to say, in the sense of being able to understand what's most important for each group or each individual, and really explaining how I can help with that. And so this district includes Johns Creek, also parts of Suwannee, Sugar Hill, Cumming, Alpharetta, and Buford. So it's a fairly large area in the northern suburbs here. As you mentioned, there's a very large Asian American community. I believe it's around 30% of the voting age population here is Asian American, and nearly half of those are South Asian. I think a lot of this comes from the idea that helping people to realize that even though people are in different communities, we share a lot of things in common. It's very easy for people to become in silos. So the Indian American community may just go to events themselves, or even within there are so many divisions, right? Or you might have the Chinese American community has their own community centers. And so does the Korean American community. But someone like me who's able to go to these different events and listen to people and see what they need, I'm starting to realize that, and we've seen that a lot of things that people care about are things that are to some degree universal, right? Things like supporting access to education, lower healthcare bills, more affordable housing. And I think some of the culturally competent ways we can do this is, first of all, I speak several Indian languages, so I'm able to actually talk about that experience, speak in those languages. I speak Tamil in particular. And also just talk about my experience as a second generation immigrant, and how a lot of what I owe my success to today is the hard work and success of my parents, family, community around me. And that's the story that's repeated so often amongst these communities, and saying that, hey, I'm someone who's kind of taking what we've already gotten from the first generation immigrants and now using that to actually give back to the community. Because people who are first generation immigrants often aren't in a position to give back because they're still figuring out how to survive. But people like us, we're able to actually get involved in politics, get involved in public service as well.
In some of my own research studying Asian American communities, what I find is that actually having an Asian American on the ballot spurs turnout. So we see more people go out to the ballot than when there's an Asian American on the ballot. And I take a look at it, looking at whether it's an Indian American candidate or a Chinese American, et cetera. And actually, I find Indian Americans in particular have the largest turnout effect when there's an Indian American on the ballot. And so I'm really curious to hear more about the community on the ground. Do you feel like they've been very engaged in past elections? Do you think that you're going to get more people out to vote than maybe haven't participated in the past? Will your campaign be able to excite people in those sort of ways?
I would be the first Indian American elected to our state legislature in Georgia.
Have others run?
Others have run, yes, but they have not won in the past. So if elected, I would be the first one here. And that's a big thing for the community. And the other thing is even the people who have run in the past, a lot of them are, I think nearly all of them were first generation immigrants. People who didn't necessarily grow up here, don't have the same strong ties to the community as I do, because I actually born and grew up here. So in a way, I'm uniquely positioned where I can speak to both that community, but I can also speak to the other communities because I went to school here. People know me not just because I'm Indian American, but they know me because of other reasons as well. And that's a huge difference. And I would say that there is a big lot of excitement there. A lot of it is sending out messages in the WhatsApp groups, because WhatsApp is a very common way that Indian Americans get their news and form communities. And I think a lot of credibility also comes from the fact that I was successful in terms of going to top schools, being able to work in the government, do a lot of things at a young age. And these are strong signals of the fact that, hey, I am doing this for a reason. I'm not just doing politics because I couldn't find a job. Like I could very easily, go off in Silicon Valley and make you could just many different ways to make money as with a tech and law background. But I decided to come back home because I saw the need for this kind of support. And I think it's really changing people's perspectives into even what it even looks like to have someone who's running for office or in public service. It doesn't have to be someone who's just, older, whiter people. It can be different folks as well, right? It can be young people like me, people who've grown up in the community, people who have seen me grow up from very young age till now, and now they're seeing the next step in terms of how I can give back too.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought all those points up. One of the points that we got to know your story is that you are this younger candidate, someone from Generation Z, who is beginning to get politically active at the moment. And I'm just wondering, as a generation that grew up literally living their whole life through tragedies of, gun violence, how are you going to tackle those type of issues, but at the same time listen to concerns of being too harsh on gun laws by older constituents?
It's a great question. I would just mention young people are not a monolith, right? There's a variety of differences even amongst Gen Z in terms of where they are politically, where they stand. So it's not like all of them will just say one thing. And of course, there are certain trends. But I think a lot of these issues involve bridging these generations. There's been a lot of door knocking, talking to people, other folks in the community. And I think part of a successful campaign needs is that you have to get support of people from across different age groups, because otherwise you won't get the vote, because it's not young people's only a certain percentage of the vote, but you also won't raise the money you need, because the reality is young people are systemically disadvantaged in the system. If I went and asked all my friends from college to fund my campaign, many of them are just starting their jobs, right? They may not necessarily be in the position to help fund a campaign and to raise hundreds of thousands of dollars that I need. And the fact that I've been able to raise, substantial amounts is indicative that I did the work, right? Of actually talking to folks who are more established in the community, who are older, different age groups, and really making this vision heard. And people realize that someone like me, not in spite of my youth, but because of my youth, I'm able to be open to different perspectives and will listen to people regardless of where they come from.
Even though young people may not have the money to give to campaigns, they certainly can vote. One of the issues, especially as a college professor, that I've seen happening, and that many, not all for sure, but many Gen Z young voters have been really charged about in the last several months is, of course, the situation in Palestine. You seem to have refrained from commenting on or participating in discussions regarding the war in Palestine. Why is that? Like, is that just a non-starter for you in your campaign? Is it an issue that perhaps lands differently in this district? I'd be curious to hear a little bit more about that, because I think for so many Gen Z folks, they see this as the issue in 2024.
One thing I'd just like to make clear is that when you're running for elected office, there's a certain number of responsibilities and powers that you have as an elected official, and a certain area you can focus on. So one person cannot solve all the problems in the world. And I think part of the reason I'm running, right, is to show folks in Gen Z that like there are different ways to attack a problem and there are different problems you have to solve. So I'm running for state senate in Georgia. There's so many issues in Georgia around access to healthcare, funding education, making things affordable, making our futures bright in Georgia. And that's more than enough already to tackle. And there's no need for every local candidate to opine on everything else happening in the world. That being said, I believe in the values that our country is founded on. I believe in universal human rights and democratic values. It's just that state legislatures aren't necessarily the most appropriate forum for that kind of like international conflicts. And there is this level of focus to politics where there's important things that need to be solved in all kinds of levels. And these are just things that are within my power to solve. And that's why I'm focusing on them.
One of the other pieces that I noticed is that you had told Ballotpedia, their candidate connection survey, they asked, is there a book, essay, or film that you would recommend to someone who wants to understand your political philosophy? And you said the Bhagavad Gita. And I was really curious about that. I would love to hear more about it. And in particular, what we've seen nationwide for Indian American candidates is that the politics in India actually end up playing out on the ground amongst voters. We've seen it in cases in Texas. Ro Khanna certainly has seen that in the Silicon Valley, a congressman from that area. I'm curious if this is also an area, certainly again, falls within the international realm, but given the number of Indian Americans that you said was in the district, is this coming up at all? Is it something that you have to deal with?
People are always following world politics. That's always an issue. I would say that the way I've approached it, right, is again, we're focusing on Georgia issues. And part of the reason why I'm running is because I worry that a lot of our American politics, especially like local politics, I don't think it should be dictated by what happens in other countries, to be honest, right? Like there's more than enough issues here already. And I really want to get our communities, particularly the Indian American or South Asian American communities, to realize that there's so many issues back home that we need to solve first. Right. And it becomes a distraction, right? If we're just focusing everywhere else, right? And I think that's something to keep in mind. That being said, I'm very proud of my heritage and my culture, my religion. You mentioned Bhagavad Gita. It's taught me a lot in terms of how to approach life, right? In terms of the idea of karma yoga, which is the idea of doing action without focusing too much on the result, but more focusing on doing your best in the action that you're doing. And that's how I've been leading my life. And it's what's led to my success so far. But I really want to show a vision for how the South Asian American community can be, where it's not just about all the politics happening elsewhere. It's about how do we empower our own communities. And I think the best way to do that is to have folks like me who came from these communities really focusing our attention on the issues which we're dealing with here in Georgia.
Perhaps sadly, we've seen these issues take root in a lot of various elections where you see Indian American candidates.
I think we just need more candidates who can clearly articulate this and explain why it's so important to focus on local issues and really bring home those issues. Because again, the politics of fear and division is too easy, right? That's what folks like Trump do, right? Where they'll just play into the grievances, they'll play into the international politics, and even the GOP often does that here in Georgia too, even towards the Indian American community. It's very easy for someone to get political power by dividing people according to their sentiments, their religion, things like that. But what I'm doing is harder, but I think it's much more important, is to build that enduring sense of solidarity amongst communities, because we're all Americans.
You're running against an incumbent who, yes, has been indicted, but still will have that incumbency advantage on the ballot. How do you think you're going to break through that incumbency advantage? That's this idea that incumbents have name recognition. People know them. People have relationships with them. And therefore, they tend to do better in an election. How do you see yourself breaking through that? Or do you feel like you'll be able to pull some of the support from Shawn Still away from him towards you? Or do you think people will maybe just stay home in this election?
I don't think people will stay home. I think what we'll see is, first of all, having a very, very strong field operation. I, being a young candidate, again, makes it much easier to recruit folks like high schoolers to knock on doors. There's a lot of grassroots energy that's already started out in terms of this campaign. There's nothing better than face-to-face conversations with voters, explaining here's why it's so important to vote for Ashwin and here's what the other side has done. That's one big part of it. The other part is making sure we can raise enough money. I think one big reason why incumbents do so well is because it's much easier for them to raise money and outspend their challengers. So far, we've been raising a lot of money, and our goal is to make sure we're able to outspend the incumbent, because that's also needed, because you have to get your message out. You're right, the incumbent does have an advantage, but it's surmountable. And the reality is, a lot of people who might already know his name know about him because of his indictment. And it's not necessarily a good thing, because when you look him up on Google, one of the first things you see is his mugshot.
And I just want to push back a little bit, because I think the head of the Republican ticket is also not only indicted, but a convicted felon, Donald Trump. Poll after poll has said that there's plenty of people who don't necessarily find that to be a problem, then they still are planning to vote for him. I do wonder if that's an effect that's going to trickle down even into this Senate election.
I'd say I highly doubt it. Time after time, you're right. Donald Trump is uniquely impervious to whatever gets thrown at him. But whenever this happens, the people who are underneath him and kind of did his work for him always end up getting thrown under the bus. Right? You've seen that with Steve Bannon, right? Or Giuliani and these people. And so Shawn Still is one of those people, right? He's not the level of Donald Trump where you can really kind of tap on that base. The fact that even now when he's campaigning, he's trying to call himself a moderate and trying to say that he's working at both sides shows that he senses his weakness. He knows that's where people are not going to like him, right? And so I think that's going to be a big difference. And I think the other thing to keep in mind is that he's not running against Joe Biden, right? He's running against Ashwin Ramaswami, a young, dynamic candidate who's Indian American, right? Who's it's a different dynamic in this race, I would say, than the presidential. And so there's a lot of folks who are going to vote for me, because of just who I am, right? Because I represent the new generation coming in to politics, and someone who's not only going to beat Shawn Still, but make sure that Democrats win up and down the ticket, including President Biden.
I sort of want to take this conversation a little bit back. And as someone who has been working on a campaign yourself for a while now, I'm wondering, what are some of the key issues that you've heard from your community that are important to them that you think you would be able to tackle?
The first is mental health in schools. There's a huge issue across the public schools here, especially after the pandemic, where people don't have access to mental health resources. And it's getting really bad, especially as competition gets more, as people are feeling more lonely, that there just aren't enough opportunities for people to really get the care that they need. And it's something I'm definitely in a position to do in terms of giving more funding for schools to hire counselors, making sure that we have those opportunities available. The second is making sure housing is affordable. Just talking to a constituent this morning, it was talking about how house prices are going up. So even people who are owning homes it's unaffordable to live there because their property taxes go up, the HOA fees go up. It's even harder for young people like me to actually go and buy a house and live in this area. And there's a concern that this area is graying because the only people who can afford to live here are folks who have lived here for many decades and maybe already have large amounts of wealth. We're not as dynamic as we could be if we were able to solve that issue. And then the final one is healthcare. Everyone's worried about what will happen once I'm in my 60s and I have to take Social Security, and will I still have access to Medicare? Is my health insurance premiums going to go up in the next couple of years? Those are some of the main issues that I've been seeing. And these are bread and butter issues that people have been facing for generations. And the reality is that our current people in office haven't been solving them. So it's time that we step up and make a change. Maybe the last thing I'll just share is that going back to being Asian American and my credentials, my background, another big result of running for office and a reason I wanted to do it is also to just change the perspective in terms of what success means for a lot of these communities. For a lot of these communities, success may mean going to a top school out of state, making a lot of money, and that's it. But I really want to change that. I want to make people realize that success isn't just about going and making money. It's important to be financially successful, but it's also about giving back to your community. And that's where I think my background is just so unique and interesting, because I went to Stanford, Georgetown, but I decided to come home and run for a seat, which only pays around $20,000 a year for 3 months in a year. And it's very obviously not successful monetarily, but it's going to be very successful in terms of changing that community. I was even just talking the other day to this Indian American girl who had always wanted to run for office when she grew up. Her parents were always telling her, don't do it, it's a waste of time, you won't make any money. But then recently her mom told her, like, I see this guy Ashwin's doing it, I guess you can do it too. You want to make it so that the young generation are in control of our own destinies. We can change things, right? And we're able to change it for the better.
Ashwin Ramaswami, candidate for Senate District 48 in the state of Georgia. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Sara, this was a great conversation we just had with Ramaswamy, and he seems to have a lot of valid points. You have to bridge the gap between the older generations and the newer generations who are becoming more politically active. Yeah,
that's right. And, state Senate elections, state legislative level elections don't often get a whole lot of airtime. They're the elections you rarely hear about. And even when you ask someone to name their state legislator, they often can't do it. But I think what's really exciting here is you have this young person, and not only is he a young person, he's a young Indian American in a district with a whole lot of Indian Americans and Asian Americans in it. And so I'll be really curious to see just to what extent he's going to be able to mobilize this base of Asian American support. As we talked about last time, candidates over the course of the last several election cycles have seen Asian Americans in Georgia as the key to election victories and have poured millions and millions of dollars into the mobilization of Asian Americans. So I think this will be an exciting race to watch.
Right. And I'm so glad that you brought up Trump as a candidate for the Republican Party, because yes, Trump is now a convicted felon, and Ramaswamy's opponent, who does face some legal issues right now. But I think, as you had mentioned, Trump might have laid a foundation to these candidates who, although they might have some legal issues at the moment, could potentially win a seat.
Yeah, I think that's right. And much to be seen about how voters really take not just Trump's conviction, but how that plays out further down the ballot. I think, as he pointed out, and I thought that was a great point, that a lot of the folks that are within the sphere of influence of Donald Trump end up not faring so well. While Trump might be wildly popular amongst his core base of support, that doesn't always translate over to other candidates. So it's going to be an interesting race.
I guess we'll just have to see. Everybody, thank you very much for joining us once again. This episode is produced by Sadia Khan and Shay Yu,
and was written by Emmanuel Monahan. The sound designer and the editor is Ben Ailman. The other music is by Epidemic Sound.
We'll see you next week.